Female Space Marines. Nothing is more likely to get the wrong sorts of nerds clutching their beards in dismay, but all in all, I kind of like the idea, and so do 28 Mag, an amazing downloadable online magazine that focuses on modelling, background, and art about 28mm miniatures. Don't worry, I'm not doing sponsorships yet, it really is that good. And one thing 28 Mag do is regular challenges, where readers are challenged to submit work around a given theme, work that could be illustrated or in the form of modelling and conversions. The current 28 Mag challenge, with a deadline of 31st of August 2021, which is 3 days from recording, is Female Space Marines. And it got me thinking, so in this video I'm going to look at the usual arguments around Female Space Marines, a bit of the history around the subject, and use that to figure out, well, how do you build them? So before we start, we should be aware that a lot of the arguments against female Space Marines are nothing but angry little boys being sexist online. That's often the underlying thing going on. But fine, let's take these arguments at face value just for a second. What are the reasons people say they don't like female Space Marines? First, because it changes the background. Okay, fine. Yeah, it would. The current fluff states that only a small proportion of people can become Space Marines. They must be male because zygotes are key to male hormones and tissue types. There you go. No female Space Marines. But it's worth saying that this isn't stated very often. It appears in this old issue of White Dwarf, but that's kind of it. The old Index Astartes books from 3rd edition don't make any mention of it. It hasn't really been a thing explicitly said in the codices for a long time. But fine, all the Primarchs are canonically male, and all the Space Marines we've been shown in the books for 30 years have at least identified as men. More on that in a bit. So we can probably agree that canonically, female Space Marines, at least at the current time, don't exist. But hold on, what about these models? And what about the Little Sisters of Purification chapter? Well, more on these models in a bit, but for now I'll just say that these weren't released as female Space Marines. They were just adventurers in powered armour, something you used to get all the time back in the Rogue Trader days, and which we still see now. And while I could delve into the Little Sisters of Purification chapter, Snipe and Wib have already done a great job of that in their video on the old Challenge magazine articles. Link in the thing below. Suffice to say that for the purposes of this, the Little Sisters are unlicensed third-party fan content and not anything officially published by GW. So, having female Space Marines in the world would require changing the background. But so what? Warhammer fluff changes all the time. Even the fluff around Space Marines has had pretty big changes before. I go into this a bit more in my recent video on canon in 40k, but Games Workshop have a few established ways of making changes that aren't just outright retcons, but would easily solve this. For one, they could just announce that female Space Marines have always been possible, like they do whenever a new model's released, and that this ancient White Dwarf article is just an example of unreliable narrator. The ancient scribe that wrote it was just wrong. That's been done plenty of times before, but it doesn't explain why we haven't seen them yet. The easiest way though is just to take advantage of 40k's new advancing timeline. Primaris Space Marines were introduced a few years ago, and in the background they're an improvement on the original Space Marine template that changes the biological procedures that go into their production. In world, as you'd expect, this is a controversial decision with the potential to be seen as heresy, but it's pushed through by Robert Guillemot. It would take one line of text to announce that Call also figured out gene seed that works on girls, a change that is completely believable in world, wouldn't change any of the previous fluff, and works really well with the Imperium's general ethos that all humans are a resource to be used. So yeah, female Space Marines would either change something or require an addition, but so what? So does everything. Finally on this point, even if it changes the fluff, how much does this really change the setting? I've been using the terms male and female Space Marines throughout this, partly because those are the usual terms used, but we know that sex and gender are kind of irrelevant to Space Marines themselves, and certainly irrelevant to any of the stories they're in. I'm conflating a few things here, but they're portrayed as effectively asexual, aromantic, have had most human emotions removed, and seem to be incapable of experiencing love except for filial, that between family. They also tend to ignore the concept of gender when dealing with baseline humans and don't really understand its relevance. So in the context of a typical Black Library novel, apart from a few pronouns, what would allowing female Space Marines actually change? Arguably nothing. Okay, next reason. But we've already got Sisters of Battle, so why do you need female Space Marines? Okay, it depends how people are making this argument, because this could mean a couple of different things. If we're talking about not needing another bolter-armed, power-armoured army in the game, well, yeah, fair enough. But female Space Marines don't add any new armies. They'd just be a modelling and background option. At most, another Primaris lieutenant or two, and we all love those, right? If we're talking about the aesthetic of women in power armor being done, well, Space Marines and Sisters of Battle have considerably different aesthetics and cultural influences, and everyone seems to be fine with having a range of different aesthetics for men in power armor. Why is women in power armor just limited to this? But mostly, I think when people say this, they're arguing that the model range already includes one faction with female models, so why do you need another? Viking army, check. Roman army, check. Female army, check. TV tropes would call this the Smurfette Principle, and the issue with it is that it assumes being female is the sole trait a character needs. It's also inaccurate in the setting. As I said, the Imperium requires everyone to serve. It doesn't care what gender the people serving are, and half the people in it are women. So even accounting for the fact that a lot of the Imperium is quite backwards by today's standards, a realistic model range should have more than one female army and some head swaps. Okay, one more reason, and this is the one I think might actually have some merit, that Space Marines can be seen as a satirical comment on, well, a number of things, including religious patriarchy, masculinity, and gender. Warhammer 40k was written as a satire of, well, many things, and one of those things was organised religion, particularly Christianity, because that was the dominant one in the UK the writers grew up in, and at the time still had over-influence on popular culture. Christianity is famously a patriarchal religion and full of father-son dynamics, and the origin stories of the Space Marines inherited a lot of that. The Horus Heresy owes a lot to Paradise Lost, and themes like the betrayal of the father are prominent in 40k. Space Marines over the years have been more and more likened to monastic orders. Space Marines being men could be seen as part of the wider religious satire of the setting. And you could go even further than this when you think about what Space Marines actually are. Children, taken before puberty and given an alternative to growing up that turns them into fighting machines. Big, strong superheroes who never get old and never get sick and hang out with their friends all day fighting bad guys. They're a silly 8-year-old boy's idea of what being a man is, all duty and honor and fighting and no emotions except anger and no girls. That's just toxic masculinity. Surprising how this one never gets used by the angry gamers, right? We could go further again and look at Space Marines through the lens of gender. We know from the fluff that Space Marines are biologically male, XY chromosomes because of the zygotes or something, right? And we know from the novels that they use he/him pronouns, call each other brother, and seem to, on the surface, identify as men. They're also coded male to us, in part down to the fact that a lot of what we recognise as masculinity is related to ideas of fighting, the military, or the suppression of emotion, and that's kind of the definition of a Space Marine. But what is the effective gender of a Space Marine? This piece by Tankpot Zoë makes a really good argument for Space Marines being effectively genderless. The gender of Space Marines is Space Marine, partly because they're little boys who never got to grow up normally. They never become men in any conventional understanding of manhood because they're no longer fully human, but their role in being depicted as men in the setting might still be important to remind us of the horror of that power fantasy. Her articles on the subject are way more nuanced than I have time for here, so I'll link to them in the thing below. Anyway, you could make the argument that Space Marines in 40k are a satirical comment on masculinity or patriarchy or gender, and that those references wouldn't work the same way if applied to female characters. But just like before, if we go down this route, we have to argue that this is relevant to the modern setting. The Horus Heresy is a great origin story, but we wouldn't lose its impact by having female Space Marines in the era Indomitus. And while I'd love to see Games Workshop dial the satire back into the game, I can't see them overtly promoting Space Marines as a comment on toxic masculinity anytime soon. Overall, I don't think arguments like this should stop us. So that should cover the usual arguments people make against female Space Marines, but none of that is the real reason they don't exist. Remember those female adventurers from back in Rogue Trader? Alan Merritt was for many years Games Workshop's head of IP, but back when those were released, he was the design manager of the studio, and in 2018 he jumped on a thread where he explained a bit of the original decision-making process. These were sculpted by the designer as female Space Marines, but it wasn't an official brief as such, and they weren't released as that. The reason there aren't female Space Marines has nothing to do with lore or background or character of Marines. It's to do with the simple logistics of making and selling miniatures. Early Citadel ranges had female versions of most character types. In fact, when we produced the C range, the intention was that upwards of 25% of the models would be female. But retailers kept complaining to us that customers weren't buying the female models, and could we not include any in the restocks? So we took the female models out of circulation. So when we got to the new Rogue Trader ranges and exciting new Space Marine model ranges, it was difficult to see how we could logistically add an occasional female model to the mix. We knew that if every Marine blister had a female model as one of the three, then folk would complain, so we didn't make any female ones. All the background fluff about why there are only male Marines is there to justify a commercial logistics issue. So the reason for Space Marines being male is basically a marketing decision based on what nerds in 1987 wanted to buy. They listened to their customer base at the time, which means that if nerds in 2021 want female Space Marines, surely the good business decision is to change it. Okay, so I've argued that there should be female Space Marines, but there aren't, and I have a challenge to do, so converting then. What would they actually look like? And more importantly, how do I make something that's believable in world and avoid all the usual sexist assumptions that female Space Marines often invite? To answer this, let's think about what Space Marines actually look like. First of all, Space Marines aren't Stormcast Eternals. I would guess that under all their armour, Stormcast Eternals all look like perfect Greek statues. Bigger than humans, sure, but in proportion, and made that way by the might of Sigmar. Space Marines aren't that. Space Marines are children kidnapped before their bodies are fully developed and stuffed full of growth hormones and additional organs through ritualized surgery. In images of this, we don't see perfect Greek statues, but over-muscled, distorted, tree-trunk torsos. In the novels, it's frequently mentioned how Space Marines have a sort of gigantism to their features, how they're too wide or out of proportion, and how that forced similarity makes it difficult for baseline humans to tell them apart at first glance. Space Marines look like humans that have been force-grown into a template because that's what they are. And this informs a number of decisions when you're building female Space Marines. Do I model my female Space Marines shorter than male ones? Well, men vary in height by about half a meter, and we know that Space Marines are recruited from planets with very different levels of health and nutrition. We know from some of the novels that Space Marines can vary in height to a degree, but when it comes to the tabletop, any differences just aren't shown. Apart from a few character models, all Space Marine models are pretty much the same height. So I think it's a stretch to assume that all female Space Marines would be somehow different. Do I model them with slimmer waists or bigger hips or shapely armor or even boob plate? Well, I'm trying to do a non-sexist army here, so the whole pin-up look doesn't really fit, but I don't think it's justified either. Again, heavy-set and slim 10-year-old boys are turned into Space Marines, and they all come out looking like tree trunks, and all the same organs need to fit into our girls' torsos, so we should assume that the growth process acts the same way. And if anyone's ever seen any actual pictures of female soldiers in combat gear, gender isn't really very obvious through it. But wait, they cry, Sisters of Battle have shapely armor and boob plate. Well, yeah, but there are some reasons for that. First, Sisters of Battle really are just really physically fit women, without the crazy growth hormones or extra organs. But also, Sororitas armor has obviously female coding because it's really important in world that people realize they're women. The Adepta Sororitas exist because of the decree passive that stops the Minotaurum from having men under arms. They're essentially a loophole. So their gender is designed to be obvious through their armor. Now, some Space Marine chapters have cultural reasons to do something similar. I guess my female Space Marines could be from, I don't know, Amazon planet or something and have molded chest plates like the Blood Angels. But since the vast majority of male Space Marine chapters don't do this, it would be a weird choice to make for my female Marines. Do I model them with makeup and cool hairstyles? Well, no. The background of Space Marines has their appearance defined by, well, warrior practicality or their home culture, and yeah, there are Space Marine cultures with long hair and presumably ones with makeup, but since they're from 1,000 different human cultures, there's no reason to assume that the rules around gender and makeup and hairstyles would be the same as they are here. I think it's much more believable to assume that female Space Marines are just as battle-scarred and shaven-headed as male ones. I mean, they're just as likely to have the augmetic implants that lead to that after all. And this is one of the biggest problems, because the easiest way to convert a female Space Marine is to stick an existing female head on a normal Space Marine. But there aren't really many suitable heads out there because they're mostly made to depict conventional human soldiers. In fact, they all tend to be a bit slim and just conventionally attractive for Space Marines. Where are my bald, screaming, scarred female heads? Would they even look any different? So shorter? Nope. Pin-up proportions? Nope. Long hair and makeup? Probably not. Just a female head swap? I'm not really a good enough sculptor to manage that. So where does that leave us? Well, for now, here's what I think a female Space Marine in full armor would look like. Exactly the same. This is what I'm going to be using as the basis for my 28 mag entry, a standard intercessor. And this is why Games Workshop should make the change. It's the easiest way of giving the fans what they want because they don't really need to make any new models. They just need to say it's possible. Right, at the time of writing, I've only got a few days left to get mine built, painted, and put on a highly meaningful diorama. So when I revisit this in a few weeks, I'll show you the final product and take a look at the other entries in the competition. Thanks for watching.